Welcome back to The Situation Room, the weekly show where you ask us about the world's problems and we tell you that things they're actually worse than you think. I'm Simon Whistler, and this week we're exploring the theoretical but very real threat that Russia and China could coordinate to simultaneously attack America's allies and force Uncle Sam to spread his forces thin. On a similar note, we're also checking in on how the concept of an Asian NATO is developing before examining the aftermath of Moldova's recent election, where a well-funded Kremlin influence campaign ended in humiliation for Vladimir Putin. So, some good news for once. Nothing better than Putin getting humiliated. Timestamps are below as always, and now on to our first, scariest question. The likelihood of Beijing and Moscow working together to spark a new world war. Big one, isn't it? Could Russia and China join forces to attack America's allies? Lennox Matt 1 asks us, as this channel has said on multiple occasions, there is a decent chance that Russia will invade a NATO nation sometime in the next few years. Given the current relationship between Putin, Xi, and Kim, would it be possible that this theoretical invasion be accompanied by a simultaneous action either by China versus Taiwan or North Korea versus South Korea? It seems to me that this would split the US ability to respond to either crisis and the West as a whole. Do you believe that this is a scenario that could happen? And our answer to that is unfortunately yes. There is a distinct chance that the scenario that you've laid out could actually happen. It's not a particularly high chance, but the odds aren't 0%. And when we're talking about a series of conflicts that would involve 6 of the world's 9 nuclear-armed nations, at a minimum, non-zero odds should be a very concerning prospect, shouldn't they? It's also a prospect that global militaries, especially the military of the United States, have been focused on for quite a while. A fair portion of American defense experts have been warning for years that the US military, in its current form, couldn't sustain major war efforts on 2 or more fronts simultaneously. If it were to try, Washington would find itself overextended, lacking sufficient forces to deter aggression from both sides at once. That analysis isn't accepted unanimously or even close, but it is an analysis shared by prominent right-wing thinkers, including from America's Heritage Foundation, who have gone on to assume important strategically oriented roles in the second Trump administration. We can see those concerns playing out in real time as the United States under Trump tries to offload some of the responsibilities of collective defense and funnel money toward large-scale procurement initiatives and military reforms. Washington's strategic worries are a major part of its efforts to encourage, or if necessary, force its European allies in NATO to jack up defense spending, rearm their militaries, and assume a posture of greater war readiness than most European nations are currently displaying. The same goes for America's encouragement of military expansion in South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and Australia, as well as other Indo-Pacific nations that could help to hold their own in a fight against China. Basically, the thinking goes that if the United States has to battle both Russia in Europe and China plus North Korea in the Pacific, and Washington has to fight essentially by itself, then even if it were to win, that war would be exceptionally costly. Nor is a victory nearly so certain as the United States would want. But if nations like Germany, France, Britain, Poland, Finland, and Italy can fight competently at scale in Europe, and Japan, South Korea, Australia, Taiwan, and other nations could rally together in the Indo-Pacific, then that changes the game. In that world, it's a far easier task for the United States to focus its attention on bolstering its allies in each parallel conflict instead of trying to take the lead and basically operating alone in both theaters simultaneously. Now, of course, every path of strategic logic for the United States has its inverse for America's adversaries, in this case consisting of Russia, China, and mostly as an appendage, North Korea, in the way that dear Lennox Mount 1 laid out. If the United States is working to actively shore up its own military, force its allies to pivot to a stance of war readiness, and make itself more able to fight several parallel conflicts at once, then Russia and China have to assume that as a result of those efforts, their respective adversaries will be stronger in a few years' time than they are today. That puts both Russia and China into a difficult position, although it's more difficult for Moscow than it is for Beijing. Although it's helped itself in the short term by pivoting entirely to a war economy, Russia is far from the military power that the Soviet Union was in its heyday, and it lacks a lot of the production capacity, especially in sophisticated warfighting equipment, that would allow it to sustain a war effort against NATO. Conversely, China is strong and growing stronger, and if all of its advanced kit works as described, then it could pose a sustained threat to any other nation in the Indo-Pacific. But if all those nations brought their own latent military-industrial might to bear against China together, with the full backing of even a distracted United States, then Beijing would face a more difficult set of circumstances. So, if China and Russia worry, as they probably should, that America and its allies are currently on a trajectory to grow stronger over time, then China and Russia are incentivized to act now before that transformation by their adversaries is complete. It's almost certainly for this reason that we've seen Russian attempts to probe and test the NATO alliance at an unprecedented rate. If those probing actions go as Moscow hopes, and Russia comes to believe that it can challenge the NATO alliance or force it to abandon its commitment to collective defense, then China is going to have a choice to make. China wants Taiwan, and while China would rather expend as little blood and as few lives as possible in order to get it, China knows that obtaining Taiwan tomorrow would be more costly than obtaining it today. Even if America could eventually beat both Russia and China while splitting its attention between the two of them, China's chances of victory are at their best when Russia is also engaging the United States in combat and vice versa. So, for that reason, it is entirely likely that if Russia were to engage NATO nations, including the United States, in a conflict that seemed likely to draw out for a little while, China might believe that it has a critical window to strike. And let's extend that line of thinking even further, because, as you've mentioned, the prospect of a North Korean attack on South Korea is also a possibility. But right now, the United States backs so many world nations with so many different security guarantees that by demanding more attention in more places from the United States all at once, Beijing and Moscow could stretch Washington even further. In that spirit, China and Russia could coordinate with Iran or Yemen's Houthi rebels or other volatile actors in the area to threaten Saudi Arabia or Qatar, jeopardizing the world's oil supply and forcing Washington to take action. In Europe, Putin and Xi could perhaps convince Hungarian leader Viktor Orban to cause problems, or could try and cajole Turkish President Erdogan to take his own decisive action in the Middle East. In East Asia, China could lean not just on North Korea, but Pakistan, potentially bringing India into the conflict and adding even further to the overall chaos. Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia could receive a wink and a nod that it's time to really explore his ambitions. Azeri leader Ilham Aliyev could be invited to show what he really thinks of a sovereign Armenia, and, well, the list goes on, doesn't it? If the goal is to divide America's attention, then chaos and confusion are the best assets that Russia and China could possibly have on their side, and with the clock ticking to both European and Indo-Pacific rearmament, there is a growing risk that the time for action is now. What happened to the Asian NATO? Okay, so from, gosh, that's a long username, we're no strangers to love 7739, who asks us, what's the progress on the Asian NATO? Participants there openly deny that they want it, but the several unilateral and multilateral treaties makes you think that it's inevitable. And to that, we'd point out that it's actually really important to the nations you're describing, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and other countries that might make up your so-called Asian NATO, that they do not ever, under any circumstances, refer to themselves as an Asian NATO. In large part, the way that collective security arrangements are talked about in Europe are dictated by the nature of the adversary that those arrangements are trying to deter. Russia, and previously the Soviet Union, are brash, highly confident, expansionist states who threaten to take hostile actions, wait to see what the response will be, and if the response doesn't seem very scary, they'll take the hostile action that they intended. But similarly, collective security arrangements in the Indo-Pacific are dictated by the adversary that those arrangements are designed to deter, and China looks at the world in a very different way than Russia does. Beijing excels when it's playing the long game, especially while it's led by Xi Jinping. And for Beijing, the preference seems to be that China will always play the long game unless it's forced to act quickly. If China's adversaries take new actions to strengthen themselves or to enter into new alliances or security arrangements, then China adjusts, continues accumulating its power, and waits for better circumstances to come along. America and its allies think in political administrations and fiscal quarters, and strategies will always change to accommodate the needs of the moment. But China thinks in decades, and even centuries. And by its own apparent logic, it will remain focused on objectives long after its adversaries have been distracted. So, where the NATO alliance is built to deter the Russian bear in basically the same way as you'd deter an actual bear, yelling and banging on things to make it clear how scary you are, the ongoing alliance building in the Indo-Pacific is focused on making sure that China keeps on playing that long game. The goal isn't to force China to back down. It's to buy time and buy time and buy time to ensure that China doesn't ever feel like the time has arrived to act aggressively. Keep convincing China to delay, and it might delay for decades. It might just delay forever. So, if Europe is trying to scare away the Russian bear, the nations of the Indo-Pacific are working to quietly, almost invisibly, create a net to contain China's ambitions. If you keep quiet and try not to spook the thing by calling yourself the Asian NATO and giving up the whole game, then the long-term strategy just might work. Russia tried to interfere in Moldova's elections. It didn't go well. Next up from Christina Valea, 7750. Could you do a short update on Moldova's elections? Alright then. Now, if you've been following this channel quite as religiously as we would hope you do, you might be wondering why elections in the former Soviet state of Moldova would be a big deal. I mean, it's a country of 2.3 million people on the periphery of Europe that until recently even most Europeans would have struggled to place on the map. Germany, this is not, so why does anyone give it? Well, the clue lies in the phrase, until recently. That's because in 2022, Moldova became another front line in Russia's war against the West, one in which the Kremlin has poured staggering resources to keep Chisinau within its orbit. Moldova, you see, doesn't just stand on the border between NATO member Romania in the west and Ukraine in the east. Since a short 1992 war, it has also been partially occupied, with a thin wedge of land declaring independence as the unrecognized state of Transnistria, the statelet whose independence is guaranteed by about 2,000 Russian soldiers. As such, it has long been in Moscow's interests to keep Moldova from drifting too close to the west. And the elections in late September proved the perfect opportunity to do just that. The pro-European ruling party, PAS, had overseen an economic crisis brought on by the war in Ukraine. The Rosa Luxemburg Foundation describes inflation up to 60% since 2021, skyrocketing living costs, and a third of the population living below the absolute poverty line. All of this in a nation that has long been one of Europe's poorest. And there were signs that voters were getting pissed off with this. In an October 2024 referendum on deeper integration with the EU, the government-backed pro-Europeans only just squeaked victory with a mere 50.35% of the vote. The No campaign, backed by the nation's pro-Russian oligarchs, came within 10,000 votes of a major upset. Clearly, this was fertile territory for a classic Kremlin influence campaign. The Center for European Policy Studies describes the run-up to this year's vote as, quote, Moscow deployed the full toolkit at its disposal: illegal funding, cyber attacks, mass disinformation campaigns, widespread vote-buying practices, and even bomb threats on election day, primarily targeting embassies and diaspora voting sites. Nor did the violence start and end with the bomb threats. There were also arrests of men accused of preparing acts of unrest should PAS win the vote. Beyond that, the BBC uncovered a Kremlin-linked network paying people to post fake pro-Russian stories on social media. All in all, then, there were fears as election day approached that the Kremlin was going to help tip the result to the pro-Russian patriotic electoral bloc. We even published a video on this very channel warning about the attempt to rig the vote. So, it was kind of a massive surprise to us all when the results came in. After all that effort from the Kremlin, including the outright buying of votes and the use of bomb threats to shut down diaspora voting sites, the patriotic electoral bloc won a middling 24.18%. PAS, by contrast, took slightly over 50%, down on their 52.8% from 2021, but still a majority of all votes cast. Far from a close race, it had been a blowout win for the pro-Europeans. And this extended to the aftermath. Before the votes were even counted, opposition leader Igor Dodon had declared victory and called for massive protests outside Parliament. In the end, a few dozen pensioners turned up with placards. To say this was a humiliation for the Kremlin is to understand just how embarrassing it was. In a month where Russian drones kept intruding into NATO airspace, it was the good news story that all of us in the West needed. But it was also a more nuanced story than simply, Kremlin lost. Because while PAS's victory was a major relief, the circumstances around it don't necessarily bode well for Moldova's future. You can see this just by looking at the campaign rhetoric. As Balkan Insight notes, each campaign was marred by alarmist rhetoric, instances of hate speech, and fear-mongering from both sides. In the case of the opposition, this included claims that a PAS victory would lead to President Maia Sandu joining forces with George Soros and Volodymyr Zelensky to launch an invasion of Transnistria, thereby dragging Moldova into the war. But PAS were little better, darkly hinting that a vote for the opposition could lead Moldova either to being occupied by Russian tanks or else joining the Ukraine war on the Kremlin side. And then there were the issues with voting. Days before voting began, 5 polling stations in Transnistria were summarily closed, with residents of the pro-Russian enclave instead forced to travel long distances into Moldova to vote, a factor that may have led to the Transnistrian vote being lower than usual. Now, we should be clear that these polling stations were closed due to a very real fear that pro-Russian officials might engage in ballot stuffing. But still, the overall impression was of President Sandu making it harder for her opponents to legally vote. It was the same with the overseas vote. While Germany hosted 36 voting stations for the overwhelmingly pro-EU local Moldovan diaspora, a similar population of Moldovans living in Russia had only 2 polling stations at their disposal, far fewer than the 17 they were granted in 2021. Again, there is some nuance here. While there are 100,000 Moldovans living in Russia, the New York Times points out that only 6% of them voted in 2021, far fewer than in Western nations. So, having 17 separate stations for 6,000 people wouldn't seem to make much sense. However, that doesn't change the fact that it looked like Moldovan citizens were being denied their right to vote based on whether they were more likely to vote for pro-Russian parties. And it's here that we get to the bleakest part of all. According to the Center for European Policy Studies, the Kremlin's main goal may have been to swing the vote, but its secondary aim is to undermine long-term trust in Moldova's democratic process. That can be done by buying votes or by pushing false narratives on social media, but it can also be done by pointing to very real examples of the pro-European ruling party seeming to put its thumb on the scales. Now, to be clear, we're not saying that PAS was incorrect to take these actions. This isn't like the Republicans and Democrats trying to gerrymander their way to victory in the United States. Moldova really is being targeted by a predatory nation over 60 times its size in population terms, one that is not only currently waging a brutal war of imperial conquest against Moldova's eastern neighbor, but which is also occupying Moldovan territory. In such circumstances, caution and extraordinary measures are warranted. But the flip side is that Moldova's political scene is now split into 2 major tribes who consider the other an existential threat. 2 major tribes that are now used to framing every single vote in apocalyptic terms. And that could cause major problems down the line. In short, while it's genuinely a good thing that PAS won so decisively, the September vote wasn't the end of Moldova's political problems. With Russia still looking to sow division and with living standards still falling in the face of energy shocks, it could be that from here on out, things only get increasingly volatile. WarFronts and Bias. Next up, this stiffy question from Chris Raymond, 2234. How about you ask non-Western-aligned experts their view of Russia-Ukraine, Iran-USA, CIA color revolutions in Asia? I'm thinking Colonel D. McGregor, Scott Ritter, Professor McGandhi, Lawrence Wilkerson, the New Atlas. We need balanced info, not Western propaganda, to make us feel good eternally. Okay, now clearly this question was asked not in the spirit of innocent inquiry, but in the spirit of someone for whom the words balanced info mean repeating Kremlin talking points about how Kiev is forever 3 days from falling, Zelensky has fled the country at least 500 times already, and Vladimir Putin is not a freaky old vampire who discusses harvesting young people's organs in order to live forever, but a lovely grandfather figure you would definitely feel comfortable leaving your children alone with. Okay, but despite this clearly being written by someone in the act of over a photo of Putin's Botox-filled face, it's also a pretty good opportunity for us to discuss our editorial policy, because if we really did just want to pump out feel-good propaganda, we could make a great deal more money doing that than what we're earning now. And to see what I mean, you can just look at the YouTube channel The Military Show. If you so wish, you can find their videos published multiple times a day with titles like NATO goes all in for Ukraine, Russia won't survive what's coming, ! Or Ukraine rips through Russia's front, ! While some of these videos have lower view counts in the tens of thousands, plenty more have hundreds of thousands of views, even millions. Millions of viewers constantly lapping up how Ukraine just can't stop winning. And while we don't have access to their back-end analytics, we're confident in saying that they're making a crazy amount of money off this. So, the financial incentive is there for us to make propaganda, and clearly the audience exists for that propaganda. If all we wanted to do was churn out feel-good nonsense for those on our side, we'd just turn this channel into a clone of the military show and then retire abroad to enjoy the resulting profits from the comfort of our mega yachts. But as capitalist as I may be, that's not what we're aiming to do with WarFronts. Ever since we moved this channel from history to current affairs, we've tried to be open about our goals and our biases, open about the fact that we do want Ukraine to win, that we think living in the West is a pretty good deal compared to most other places, and that we think shilling for a revanchist imperial state like Russia while living in Europe or America is like bigging up the advantages of flavored gruel while gorging yourself on chocolate ice cream. Personally, I like Ben & Jerry's, but just because we have biases, like everyone else, it doesn't mean that we let them cloud our judgment. In fact, you could say that our basic mission is to try and recognize the wishful thinking on our own side and challenge it as best we can. Just look at last week's video, where our lead story was a deep dive on the ways that Ukraine's manpower crisis is causing very serious problems for Kyiv at the front. Or check out our Kursk coverage, which was critical of the Ukrainian decision to try and hold Russian lands. Or our multiple videos covering all of the ways that Europe's militaries are still lacking and still need to get serious about defense over 3 years since the war began. Because that's the thing about biases, you can't avoid them. Having them's just part of being a f***ing human. But if your biases are causing you to only see the good news and close your eyes to the very real problems on your side, then you are failing to be a serious person, aren't you? And that's as true for those addicted to the military show as it is for those who watch what Chris Raymond2234 calls, with an impressive lack of irony, balanced info. In this case, a euphemism for the endless videos with titles like "The End of NATO!" All of them assuring us that every Russian military setback is just a very clever feint, which will soon lead to Kremlin victory. And that's fine. If all you want to be told over and over again is that you are a special person whose edgy opinions are always right. But we here at WarFronts like to think that our audience is deserving of more than that. And so, we try to bring you the most balanced news we can while always remaining open about our own potential biases, including that we want Ukraine to win and that we believe the world would be a better place if Vladimir Putin fell out of a window tomorrow after shooting himself 27 times in the head. Allegedly. And now with that out of the way, let's move on to the fun questions, shall we? Because it's time to briefly invite Morris and Evan out of the basement to hear what they have to say. Biggest military failures. Chris Pontius asks us, what's your favorite biggest failure in military operation or battle? Evan says, I don't know that I have a favorite military failure, given the implications that usually come with it, but I'll spotlight the failure of Nazi Germany at the Battle of the Bulge in the waning months of World War II. The battle was essentially the last gasp of the German war effort, one all-out attempt to turn the tides and extend the war. For one thing, the defeat of Nazi Germany is already a pretty massive positive, but going beyond that, the Battle of the Bulge could have resulted in the war being prolonged at a time when weapons of war like the atomic bomb were on the brink of going operational. An estimated 70 to 85 million people died during World War II between direct and indirect casualties, but that death toll could have climbed a lot higher if the war had been allowed to extend past August of 1945. Morris says, like Evan, I have to say that the word favourite might not be appropriate here, but I must admit that any time I hear that the Rapid Support Forces have lost a battle in Sudan, no matter how minor, my heart gives a little cheer. Don't get me wrong, their principal opponents, the Sudanese Armed Forces, are a brutal and increasingly Islamist-aligned group of coup-supporting killers who seem to care little if their bombs land in civilian areas. But the RSF are just orders of magnitude worse. They're a swarm of genocidal locusts that has and pillaged its way across Sudan, committing horrors so unspeakable they would make f***ing ISIS blush. This is the group whose soldiers stand accused of children as young as 1 year old, a group that operated prisons around Khartoum where hundreds of civilians were tortured to death, and that credibly stands accused of genocide against the Masalit and Sakawa peoples. In short, they're the closest the world currently has to a literal incarnation of evil, and every time they suffer a battlefield setback, I feel noticeably happier. And my answer's just like, I think it's been an answer before, invading Russia in winter. Beard or hair? Next one just for me, apparently. From Glenn Halliday, 3301. Would Simon trade his beard for a full head of hair? No, I wouldn't. Because they say that if you don't have a strong chin, grow a beard. Yes. Any good news out there? Finally, an upbeat question from Bilal Al-Madali, 2379. Try number 4. What was your favourite bit of positive recent world news? Maura says, oh, and the Steel Ball Run anime was confirmed, obviously. Got no idea what you're talking about, Morris, despite this. Evan, this year I decided to become a passionate follower of the 12th Annual Fat Bear Week, a competition organised by America's National Park Service and meant to celebrate the brown bears of Katmai National Park in Alaska. Around this time of year, the bears in Katmai are eating as much salmon as they physically can, trying to pack on weight in order to see their way through the wintertime hibernation season. This week, nearly 2 million people voted to anoint Katmai's fattest bear. And to that end, I'd like to extend my sincere congratulations to the winner himself, Certified Fat Bear 32 Chunk. My one is so dark, but also so good. That douchebag from Lost Profits got stabbed to death in prison. Oh no! Anyway, that's the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for being here.